There are a lot of different graffiti mops out there that you can buy yourself, and an infinite number, really, of graffiti mops that you can make DIY style. And as a graffiti artist, and from talking to other graffiti writers as well, I think everyone sort of agrees that it's just plain fun to try out different graffiti mops and markers. But at the end of the day, how many of those mops that you buy to try out do you actually end up using on a regular basis? Well, if you're like me, you probably have about 2 or 3 mops that you use semi-regularly, but that certainly doesn't stop us from all wanting to try out more and more graffiti mops. But that brings me to my point. I get asked a fair bit, Sciz, I want to use just one mop. What's a good all-around mop for me to buy and try out? And my answer to that question today is, well, let's take a look at the On The Run Soultip 004 squeeze marker and test it out in a full review and tagging test, because I think this mop has the potential to become one of those mops that has a good mix of features that makes it a nice all-around mop to have. And let me explain what I mean by that first, while I tell you some of the most important features about this OTR Soultip 004, and then we'll head over to our surface testing area. We'll fill it up with some Soultip paint and throw some tags up to see how it feels to actually tag with. So if that sounds good to you, let's get to it. This 004 squeeze mop really checks a lot of boxes for me if I am looking for sort of an all-around graffiti mop that's just going to be good to have with me all the time. I'll tell you what I mean. I'll start off with the basics. Number one, it just has a nice, normal, pretty standard 12mm mohair nib. The 12mm is a nice in-between size. You can write nice and big with it, but you can also get into some slim surfaces, if you will. Also, the mohair nibs tend to be a little bit higher quality than your standard cotton nibs, at least in my experience. You would think the longer hair would make them catch on more stuff, but that doesn't seem to be the case when they're nice and juiced up. This one in particular has like the longest, can you see that? It has like the longest actual mohair on the nib, but I mean, that's fine. Number two, the mop has a fairly squeezable body. It's far from hard, I will say. It's also not quite as squeezable as something like the 003 Soultip, which I've reviewed if you want to check out. So again, that's another way it's sort of an in-between. It's a nice in-between squeezability. And number three, it's got a 75ml reservoir here. So it's far from a mini mop, obviously. It's also not gigantic though. It's sort of in between. The shape makes it not quite so bad if you want to carry it in your pocket. It would be a little bit bulgy, but it's far from the worst things you could be trying to carry with you. It's obviously very similar to like a Krink K60 in shape and size. So if you've ever had one of these with you, you know what that feels like to carry. So again, a nice in-between. So I'm hoping you guys are getting the idea that this 004 Soultip squeeze mop has really found an in-between in terms of shape, carryability, reservoir size, nib size, and durability, and squeezability as well. But you don't have to take my word for it, because we are going to head over to our testing area and throw some tags down to see how this looks and feels to write with. So let's go do that. Welcome back to the testing area, everyone. While we're at it, I just want to say thank you for all the support you guys showed on the the Chrome formula test video that we did, where we tested a bunch of Chrome formulae out at the same time. So thank you to everyone for that, if you want to check that video out. The link is in the cards in the corner. So the 004 Soultip. I should mention that it can be bought in my area for the equivalent of roughly $3.5 US empty like this, so not a bad buy at all. Or you can buy it pre-filled with one of, I think, 10 colors for roughly the equivalent of $8 US. And with such a common nib size, I'm certain you can find some good replacement nibs for it, whether it just be more of the OTR ones, or if you have another brand of nibs that you find works better for you, that's all good either way. So let's get this filled up with the recommended paint that they say you should use in it, which is the Soultip paint. Of course, obviously you can fill just about any mop with just about anything, but since that's what they're saying it's used for and what you can buy it in, that's what we're gonna use. I should tell you this color is apparently hot pink. It looks more like a purpley pink to me, but whatever. I don't know what it is, but there's something just incredibly beautiful about a cleanly filled mop. Maybe it's because that never happens for me. I'm so bad at that. Yeah, this definitely looks more purple than pink to me, but I won't be focusing too much on the formula that we're using today in here because I want to do a specific video where I talk just about the Soultip paint formula. Instead, what I'll be doing while I tag some names of subscribers up who have asked me for hit-offs is I'll be focusing mostly on the squeezability of the mop, how controllable this mop is compared to other mops specifically, of course, and how it feels to write with. Aside from that, I'll be also commenting on how smooth the nib feels on sort of a fairly smooth surface that we're using here today, and if it stands up to the most basic of tests, basically, which it really should. So hopefully that gives you guys a good picture of what this mop is actually like to write with and use. So let's start off by shouting out Hulk. He's been a long-time viewer. He's got a birthday either coming up or it may have just passed. Either way, happy birthday to you, Hulk. Let's throw a tag up here. So I don't mind saying this mop right away sort of outdid my expectations. Like with a standard mop of any kind, you sort of feel like, okay, it's gonna be a mop. It's probably gonna be functional and fine. But right away, like the squeezability with this mop is actually something that I think should be highlighted because it is probably a little bit more squeezable than your average mop. And with a reservoir this shape specifically and size, I found right away when this is filled up nice and full, like with the Hulk tag, the Sallow tag, HSK tag, you're seeing that those were like very drippy, and that was like without really trying to squeeze too hard. So I really enjoyed that. You have pretty nice controllability overall. I'm still used to using some thicker paint formulae than this Soultip paint, and the Soultip paint being a little bit runnier definitely caught me off guard a bit since I don't use it too regularly, but still really enjoying it. You're seeing with the later tags too that you're able to get some fairly dripless lines. Of course, if you're using a drip mop, you're gonna get drips, and that's what you should sort of want with a drip mop, but it's nice enough to write some nice clean tags as well. I do have to say I love the color. I said I wasn't gonna talk about this paint too much, but I just love this color. The only thing that I'm worried about right off the bat with this is with a lot of these mops, when they do get sort of closer to empty, it does start to be a little bit irritating to write with. You really have to squeeze. Luckily, you can do that with this mop. You can squeeze as much as you need to. There's nothing worse than a mop where there's 20 mils of paint left in it and you just want to do some good tags and you can't because it's too hard of a body. So you're probably not going to have that problem with this. At the same time, you do have to consciously at a certain point make sure you're squeezing a little bit harder to keep the nib nice and saturated so that it runs smoothly. Isn't like you're grinding a dry nib on a surface and wearing it out. The nib so far is holding up quite well. It's not like we've done much with it though, obviously, but to sort of counter my own point, this is just a painted wood surface, so it's not the smoothest thing we could be testing on, and there are some nibs out there that probably would already be falling apart a little bit. As you can see here, the nib's really nice. Like it's holding up beautifully, and overall this mop just looks so clean, and it's a gorgeous mop. One other quick thing about the squeezability is when you are squeezing the mop and the nib is in and it has paint in it, it sort of doesn't let the pressure out of the mop as quickly, so you get a bit of a lag in terms of the mop filling back up to its normal sort of size. I sort of like that. It makes it feel much more responsive to you in a way. I'm not sure if that makes sense. That could just be me being crazy, but that's what I do find. So I feel like most people will find this mop comfortable enough. Some people aren't a fan of like the super fat mops. I sort of find them nice. It gives you a bit more control, I feel like, myself. But let's just quickly try and throw up a few tags and make them super drippy, because I know a lot of you guys are waiting for that. Gotta please the drip heads out there, right? But after that, I actually compared the Soultip 004 Squeeze Mop to a bunch of other similar mops on the graffiti market from some of the bigger brands. So after that, we'll talk about some of the differences in quality and features of some of the most similar mops by different brands that relate to the Soultip 004 Squeeze Mop. But let's get some super drippy stuff up here. How about that? So overall, these drippy tags aren't quite as drippy, unfortunately. It really is a little bit harder to squeeze a lot when this thing's about half full now. And that being said, I do want to just outline quickly that I've used about 25% of the paint that I filled this with, and we've done about 15 tags. So if you're wondering how many tags you can realistically get out of this, probably around 60 is actually fair to say. A bit more, a bit less, depending on how many drips you want. But when you consider this is 75 milliliters and you can get 60 tags out of it, that's only 1.25 milliliters per tag, which is actually quite impressive when you think about it that way. But that being said, I think it's definitely time now to talk about some other brands that have similar mops to the 004 Soultip Squeeze Mop and see which ones have possibly better value for you depending on if you want to get long-term use out of a mop. I would say similar mops of some of the main graffiti brands to the Soultip 004 are, hear me out, the Krink K60, the Molotow Dripstick 860DS, and the Grog Squeezer 10 FMP. And knowing why I chose those mops as ones that have some similarities and some differences to the Soultip 004 might help you figure out which ones have features that are more valuable to you and might be worth picking up for yourself. So to start off, here's a chart with all the reservoir sizes of each of those 4 mops. The only one I couldn't explicitly find was the Molotow Dripstick 860DS. Maybe it's 86. Is that way it's 860, I don't know, someone in the comments who knows, let everyone else know, help everyone else out. But personally, I find that the Grog and the Molotow Dripstick, they're just too big, frankly. Like, these are just irritating sizes to carry around. Whereas the Krink and the Soultip, obviously not ideal, but for full-size mops, they're not that bad to carry around with you. Jeez, it's pouring outside. Can you guys hear that? It's incredible. And that really is the only major downside, I would say, with the Soultip 004 Squeeze Mop, and that is that it is just bulky, right? But that's the trade-off you're doing. You're getting that 75 milliliter reservoir space and losing a bit of carryability. If you are looking for something that's super small and carryable, I would recommend my review that I did of the 007 Soultip paint marker. You can check that out in the cards in the corner or in a link in the description. The nib sizes on each of these mops and the Grog one are all very similar. That's one of the reasons I chose them as similar mops across brands. But I do have to say the mohair nibs on the OTR mop specifically are usually a little bit nicer in my experience, although it does largely just come down to how often you're using them and on what surfaces. But the biggest 2 factors that differentiate the 004 Soultip Squeeze Mop from these other choices here are A, just the squeezability of it. That extra squeezability that you get for me is a big advantage, and I think most people would agree as well. And B, these are much cheaper than the other options here, other than the Grog Squeezer. And those 2 are so close in price that it's a little bit pedantic to pick out the differences. And regardless of the paint formula, because you can fill this with any paint or ink obviously, I think this does actually make a very good all-arounder that you might want to consider if you're looking just to have one mop that's pretty much the main mop you use. It's always nice to have a main mop that has a nice standard nib size on it as well. But if you guys have any current mops that are your go-to mops that you just can't leave the house without, put it down in the comments and let everyone know. The more points of view we can share with each other, the more informed we all are, and the better we can make decisions about what kind of mops and paints are going to be the best for each of us personally. If you want to see more about some of the graffiti mops specifically we have reviewed on this channel, I have a playlist I'll put on screen now of specifically graffiti mop reviews that might help you figure out what kind of mop you might be looking to buy as well. And if you do want to look at specifically my personal favorite mops, some of them at least, you can check out my top 5 mops in that video on screen as well. If you're curious about the shirt, one of the first links in the description will be to where you can pick up a tags, throws, and pieces shirt for yourself in an array of colors. But I hope to see you in one of those videos on screen soon. Until next time, peace.